Thank you to have invited me, and I'm sorry not to be with you because of a ban put by the American government. I will present to you work in progress, where I have already uh, written a book, and it is about a very peculiar subject. It's the language and the influence of a language on economic policy and on social policy. I am using in all that work the word that the newspeak, according the terminology of George Orwell, that the newspeak has erased. Erasing a word is like throwing away books and amputating our ability to make ourselves understood with a million of combinations. Nothing can justify it. It is a violence to be deprived of a concept to express one's thought. That shrink. And the great communicator had understood this. Orwell, of course, but before him, Goebbels. And the impoverishment of the language allows thought to converge. This is how we can finally understand what some expressions, which were bizarre, like pensée unique in France, unique thought, or like the Washington Consensus in the US, or mainstream economics, we can understand what is the purpose of this shrinking of a language in this proof of trying a new theory. And the problem that is essential to this process is that impoverishing the language allows the convergence of the thinking. And Goebbels was saying that he is not willing that people think like him, but he wants to impoverish the language in such a way that people can't do otherwise but to think like him. It is through the mediation of the language that everything passes and happens. But the word can be a problem, even for the best communicator. For example, you can have a financial crisis, which implies that the newspeak has to be changed in an urgent way, or you can have a COVID crisis where the newspeak should be changed also in a very urgent way to be audible by the people. And what is happening then is that the great communicator proceed changing their word as if nothing had happened. For example, they will pass in one breath from the necessity of rigor to the necessity of deficit, or as did happen in some country in Europe, I don't know, in the US, to the absolutely unnecessity of a mask to the absolute necessity of a mask. So they will go from one extreme to the other without saying that they have changed their vocabulary, because they hope that at the end, the reason will come back and the whole situation will again prevail. And that means that the newspeak is here for a long time. For example, the world has gone through really radically different events: German unification, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of Soviet Union, the financial crisis, the COVID crisis, and so on and so forth. And we are still using the same language as far as political economy is concerned to try to understand what is going on. So I am coming to the conclusion that in actuality, we are no more understanding very well the world around us. Our language is too poor to understand it. And on the field of fact, we have not solved a lot of problems, socially, economically, and politically. So to try to understand this enigma, the great science fiction authors like ours are of great help. In 1984, Orwell described a process that Big Brother has set up to make society converge toward the official thought. There is a commissioner of record, which is define the party line, which define the party line, and the Ministry of Truth, which is charged of the consistency of a language, of the consistency of a message, which the government wants to pass now with history. So this ministry is rewriting the old book so as they are consistent with the new book. So we are, seems to me, not very far from this picture of world of language that Orwell is giving. We are not very far without coercion, of course, but through method of persuasion, media control, repetition, and social sanction that encourage self-censorship. The atmosphere of courtesanship and the spirit of propaganda that characterize certain media bear witness to the road already traveled. And think to the cancel culture or to the woke movement. It's exactly what is at stake. It is political economy that will serve for illustration of my point. One of the stratagems used by the newspeak, I know that I will meet contradiction on this point. One of the stratagems used by the newspeak in this field is to have flattened time in order to create from the outset an ambiguity about the chronology of theoretical contribution. Neoclassical theory, Keynesian theory, etc., etc. But what is clear is that this flattening of time seems to me has allowed to invert the time arrow, putting classical theory as the modern theory and Keynesian theory as the archaic theory. That means as if the 30s preceded the 20s. The curiosum is that among this set of theory, only the Keynesian theory is explaining unemployment. Neoclassical theory is not. And we know the reason why. Many contributions have been done by authors in this room. And despite this, neoclassical theory has won the intellectual battle. Has won the intellectual battle because it has reconstructed itself in an elegant way, using with care mathematical language. And so the aesthetic of it is much better than the one of Keynesian theory. But that does not change anything. It does not change the fact that Keynesian theory was succeeding neoclassical theory, not the contrary. The rest follow from this. The Keynesian word has a pejorative connotation and refer to a retarded teenager or to an economist insufficiently trained in mathematics. And what is clear from that and the importance of that is for the evolution of discipline. It is very difficult for a professor to give as a thesis, the subject of a PhD, a Keynesian question, because it will not help the career of the student. So that means that there is in this evolution something which will lengthen the evolution of our discipline. And despite that, for example, Gregory Mankiw, which was once president of a council of economic advisors, said that in a paper called The Scientist and the Engineer, that despite all that, economic policy is still governed by Keynesian theory, not by neoclassical theory. But that is in the United States. In Europe, it's a bit different. In Europe, it is a bit different because, and especially because, the European construction has grounded the economic policy on rules rather than discretion. And so there is no way of handling economic policy instrument because they are freezed by rules. In fact, this rule prevent the use of policy instruments. So in this context, the Newspeak will deploy its power in two directions. The first is to convince us that everything has been done to solve the haunting problem we face: unemployment, precariousness, inequality. Unfortunately, nothing has worked. And of course, nothing can't work in a context where you can use the policy instrument only in a homeopathic way. And, and by dint of repeating this, we become convinced that nothing will solve any of our problem. And it is unfortunate, but we can't mourn the impossible. The second direction is more concrete. It is saying that the problem we are confronting are, in fact, the responsibility of a population, not of the government. The population is resisting reforms. I mean, in Europe, the population is resisting the reform. The unemployed, like the poor, do not want to move to alleviate the burden that they put on society. We reject wage cuts as well as pension reform, unemployment compensation reform, labor law reform. In short, all the changes where we live fever. The time has come to ask ourselves what we can do for our country. And what is the result of that? In actuality, we have done a lot of reform in Europe. They have passed not really, they have not have been observed, but they exist. And we have done a lot of reform. But after 1,000 reforms, we have not solved the problem we are confronted to. So what the result of all that is to say to the population, we have not gone that far to solve the problem. We are still not arrived to the point where the reform process can solve our problem. In this context, it is in this context that the Newspeak expression, the end of work, seems to sound the death knell for the remuneration of work, leaving only the respite that structural reform would allow. It may also be thought that its evocation only serves to make the above-mentioned reform to be implemented at the detriment of the bargaining power of wage earner, and so to the detriment of a wage level. But the end of work is a fairly strange hypothesis, probably prompted by our ancestral fear of technical progress. Since it is strange, since it could also lead to a world of abundancy, as in Keynes' economic perspective for our grandchildren. The increase in productivity due to technical progress will allow our grandchildren to be 8, 12, whatever times richer than us, so as to solve the economic problem. So in one representation of this new speed, we have the end of war. In another, we have the end of the economic problem. So what is clear in Europe is that there is still impediment to economic policies. And this impediment to economic policy comes from the doctrine as it has been rephrased by the new speaks. Thank you very much.
We have some time for a question or two, if we have any. Jean-Paul, you won't be able to see everyone, but you'll be able to hear whoever speaks. It.
It was fascinating. Thank you. I'm not quite sure how this fits in, but I have been listening to a lot of analysis of voting pattern. And one of the things that's coming up is that people vote their anger. And what we are hearing in so much of the media is a deliberate stoking of anger. And I felt a bit in the newspeak, this is seems to be part of what it is. But I'm trying to see how that fits in with the economic paradigm that you're speaking of.
You mean the media?
Yeah, I mean, we are.
Media has a big part of this paradigm. A big part of this paradigm because they are in charge of kind of propaganda and of censorship of the debate by choosing the argument, by choosing the people, especially in the television. They are really having a kind of effect of propaganda for the idea they defend. If I look at the media in Europe now, and especially in France, where there will be a presidential election in April, they are all on the same track. They are all defending the same position. So what is incredible is that they are acting as if they have learned the Newspeak dictionary and they are repeating it to the public without any change between the different TV or between the different newspaper. There has been a phenomena which has shown this in a fairly clear way. It is the rise of a new candidate for the presidential election called Eric Zemmour. And Eric Zemmour now is considered as the bad guy of the scene by all the media. Maybe it is. Maybe he is the bad guy. But I mean, the fact that all the media are thinking the same is something which is difficult to accept. And by the way, the idea of working from the language came from the observation of the media and from their identity of view, even if they are supposed fairly different. I don't know if I answer your question.
Part of what I was getting at least I know the US media, whether it is Fox News on the right or CNN, MSNBC, this 24-hour news cycle, they are all, and partly because it's the selection of who is on the show, they are all stoking this rising anger among the population, which also fits in with Professor Gelfand's discussion and the discussion we had yesterday on Europe. And it is newspeak in the 1984 context that is really changing the entire way people are relating to each other and the way they think about each other. And the real question gets back to, does society survive? Sorry, if we're all at each other's throats.
I mean, if society can survive to this effort of the media, I am rather asking me what will be the fate of democracy if all this impoverishment of language, all this exaggeration of language by some media, if all that is not actually killing democracy. And the impression I got in observing both the US and Europe is almost the same, is that democracy begin to have a problem. And inequality impinge a lot on the problem of democracy, because as Socrates said, you can have in a country or a few rich, the wealth concentrated in a few hands, or you can have democracy, but you can't have both.
Jean-Paul, we know that the Newspeak dictionary is the only one that gets smaller every year, but I think there's a new entry, at least in the European version, of structural reform. Would that be, how would you feel about that?
Yeah, structural reform is the, the main entry of the European construction. And why? Because it is consistent with the fact that you have some sovereignty left to the nation. The structural reform has to be done by the countries of Europe, but the countries of Europe have no instrument, no macroeconomic instrument to lead the policy. So what the structural reform in this Newspeak dictionary is telling to the people is that, in a way, as sovereign people, they are responsible of what is the fate of the country. It is as if the Newspeak has taken the say of Kennedy. Don't ask what the country can do for you. Ask you what you can do for the country. And structural reform is asking to people sacrifices to resolve their own problem. For example, as I said, a decrease of unemployment benefit, decrease of wage, and a decrease of health expenditure, of which we have seen the consequences with the COVID crisis. So you are perfectly right, Richard.
Okay, I think we will end there. Thank you very, very much, Jean-Paul.
Thank you.